The B-17 Flying Fortress was hemorrhaging oil at 15,000 feet, its No. 3 engine sputtering like a dying heartbeat over the frozen German countryside. Staff Sergeant Henry Dobbins wedged himself into the cramped space behind the cockpit, his hands already black with grease, knowing that in less than 10 minutes they would either plummet into Nazi territory or he would have to improvise something that had never been tried in the history of aerial warfare. He thought of his father's words on their Iowa farm, words spoken over broken tractors and failing equipment during the Dust Bowl years: stay calm, use what you got, and remember that every machine talks if you listen close enough. What happened next in that freezing metal tube racing through hostile skies would become the stuff of legend, a field repair so unconventional that military engineers would spend months trying to understand how it possibly worked. But before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The story of Henry Dobbins began not in the skies over Europe but in the flat, endless prairies of Iowa, where the earth stretched out like a wrinkled brown blanket and the only things that broke the horizon were grain silos and the occasional windmill spinning lazily in the summer heat. Born in 1921 to Walter and Margaret Dobbins, Henry grew up in a world where nothing came easy and everything required fixing at least twice. The Dobbins family farm sat 5 miles outside of a town called Waverly, a collection of 300 souls who knew each other's business better than their own and where the general store doubled as the post office, the gossip center, and the place where farmers gathered on Saturday mornings to complain about the weather and the government in equal measure. Walter Dobbins was a tall man with shoulders like fence posts and hands that looked like they had been carved from the same oak wood as the barn beams he occasionally had to replace. He had served in the First Great War, though he never spoke of it except on the rare occasions when he had too much whiskey at Christmas, and even then his words came out fractured and incomplete, as if the memories themselves had been shattered by shellfire and could never quite be reassembled properly. What the war had taught Walter was that survival often depended on improvisation, on making do with whatever materials were at hand when proper supplies were 1,000 miles away and help was never coming. He brought that philosophy home to Iowa and applied it to farming with a dedication that bordered on obsessive. The Dobbins farm ran on equipment that should have been retired a decade before Henry was born. There was the 1908 tractor that Walter had purchased second-hand in 1923. Its engine so temperamental that it required a specific sequence of curses and mechanical adjustments before it would consent to start on cold mornings. There was the threshing machine held together with wire and determination, and the irrigation pump that Walter had rebuilt so many times that it bore almost no resemblance to its original factory specifications. But everything worked, after a fashion, because Walter Dobbins possessed an almost supernatural ability to diagnose mechanical problems and devise solutions using whatever materials happened to be lying around the barn. Henry learned at his father's elbow, starting from the time he could hold a wrench without dropping it. By age 7 he could identify engine problems by sound alone, distinguishing between a fouled spark plug and a cracked piston ring from 50 yards away. By 10 he was helping his father perform complete engine overhauls, his small hands perfect for reaching into spaces where Walter's thick fingers could not fit. By 12 he had improvised his own repairs, once keeping the tractor running for an entire harvest season using a belt fashioned from old leather horse harnesses and a carburetor float made from a wine cork and some copper wire. Walter had looked at that repair with something approaching pride and said, "That is ugly as sin, boy, but if it works, and that is all that matters when crops need bringing in." The Depression hit Iowa like a hammer blow in 1929, and what followed were years that tested every bit of ingenuity that the Dobbins family possessed. Crops failed when the rains did not come. Dust storms rolled across the plains like brown tidal waves, burying fences and filling barns with grit that got into every machine and ground away at every moving part. Banks foreclosed on farms up and down the county, and families that had worked the same land for 3 generations packed their possessions into trucks and headed west toward California and the false promises of fruit-picking jobs. The Dobbins farm survived partly through luck, partly through Walter's stubborn refusal to give up, and largely through an endless series of mechanical improvisations that kept their broken equipment functioning just long enough to get through one more season. Henry became a master of scrap pile engineering during those years. When they could not afford new parts, he fabricated them from whatever was available. He made gaskets from old rubber boot soles. He fashioned replacement springs from wire taken off abandoned fence lines. He once repaired a broken gear assembly using components from a broken pocket watch, a bicycle chain, and part of an old windmill gear, creating a hybrid mechanism that somehow managed to distribute power more efficiently than the original factory design. Other farmers started bringing their equipment to the Dobbins place, knowing that if anyone could resurrect a dead machine it was Walter and his boy. They paid in chickens sometimes, or a share of their harvest, or simply with the promise to help out when the Dobbins family needed extra hands during planting season. School for Henry was an intermittent thing, attended when farm work allowed and skipped when it did not. He was bright enough that teachers let it slide, and besides, half the boys in his class were in the same situation, their education interrupted by the rhythms of agricultural life. What Henry learned from books interested him less than what he learned from machines. History seemed like a collection of dead facts about dead people who had made dead mistakes. Mathematics was useful only insofar as it helped calculate gear ratios and fuel mixture percentages. English composition held no appeal whatsoever. But give Henry a broken engine and a box of spare parts and he would work for hours with the focused intensity of a surgeon, his hands moving with confidence through disassembly and diagnosis and repair. He graduated high school in June of 1939 with mediocre grades and no particular plans for the future beyond staying on the farm and helping his father. The world beyond Iowa existed mostly as radio reports and newspaper headlines, distant events in distant places that seemed to have no connection to the business of planting corn and maintaining equipment. Europe was sliding toward war again, but that was Europe's problem. Henry was 18 years old and had never been more than 100 miles from home. He assumed his life would continue along the path it had always followed, the cycle of seasons and harvests, the familiar routines of a farming existence, perhaps eventually marrying some local girl and starting his own family on a piece of land adjacent to his father's spread. But the world had different plans. In September of 1939 Germany invaded Poland and the Second Great War began. America tried to stay out of it, but by 1941 the writing was on the wall. Henry had been following the news more closely by then, listening to radio broadcasts about the Luftwaffe bombing London and the German army rolling across France and the Low Countries. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December of that year, Henry knew that the farm life he had known was about to be interrupted. In February of 1942, with the spring planting still 2 months away, Henry walked into the recruitment office in Waterloo and enlisted in the Army Air Forces. He was 20 years old, weighed 160 pounds, and had no idea how to fly an airplane, but he figured if he could fix a tractor he could probably fix whatever machinery the military threw at him. Basic training at Shepherd Field in Texas was a shock to his system. Henry had never experienced heat like the baking furnace of a Texas summer, where the sun beat down with physical force and sweat soaked through uniforms within minutes of stepping outside. He had never been around so many people from so many different places, city boys from New York and Boston who had never touched a wrench in their lives, farm boys like himself from Kansas and Nebraska and the Dakotas, boys from the South with accents so thick Henry could barely understand them. The military moved with a kind of organized chaos that bewildered him at first. There were rules for everything, regulations and procedures and hierarchies, a vast bureaucratic machine that seemed designed to crush individual initiative and turn human beings into interchangeable parts. But Henry adapted. The physical conditioning was no harder than a day's work on the farm. The discipline made sense once he understood the reasons behind it. And when it came time for mechanical aptitude testing he scored higher than anyone in his training group, his hands moving through the disassembly and reassembly of various machines with a speed and confidence that attracted the attention of his instructors. They assigned him to aircraft mechanic training, a 6-month intensive course at Keesler Field in Mississippi where he learned the specific systems and procedures associated with military aircraft. Henry discovered that an airplane engine was not fundamentally different from a tractor engine, just more complicated and less forgiving of mistakes. Both turned chemical energy into mechanical motion. Both required proper fuel mixture and cooling and lubrication. Both would tell you what was wrong with them if you paid attention to the signs. He excelled in the program, graduating third in his class and earning the rank of Staff Sergeant along with a posting to a B-17 bomber crew and training at MacDill Field in Florida. The B-17 Flying Fortress was a massive aircraft, 74 feet long with a wingspan of over 100 feet and 4 huge radial engines that together produced nearly 5,000 horsepower. It could carry a bomb load of up to 8,000 pounds, was armed with 1350 caliber machine guns, and required a crew of 10 men to operate. Henry's job as flight engineer was to monitor all the aircraft's systems during flight, manage fuel distribution, assist with navigation, man one of the gun positions during combat, and perform any emergency repairs that might be needed while airborne. It was a position that required technical knowledge, physical courage, and the ability to stay calm when everything was going wrong at once. His crew formed up in August of 1942 under the command of First Lieutenant James Rourke, a 24-year-old pilot from Philadelphia who had learned to fly before the war as a hobby and who treated the massive bomber like it was his personal sports car. Rourke was a good pilot, smooth and confident, with an instinctive feel for how the aircraft handled under different conditions. His co-pilot was Second Lieutenant Paul Griggs, quieter and more methodical, the kind of man who checked everything twice and trusted in procedures rather than instinct. The bombardier was Lieutenant David Chen, a second-generation Chinese-American from San Francisco who had a degree in engineering from Berkeley and who could calculate bombing trajectories in his head faster than most men could work them out on paper. The navigator was Lieutenant Robert Kowalski, a former high school math teacher from Chicago who approached navigation with the same systematic precision he had once used to teach geometry. The enlisted men rounded out the crew. The radio operator was Sergeant Frank Morrison, a motor mouth from Boston who could talk continuously for hours without seeming to draw breath. The ball turret gunner was Sergeant Vincent Luciano, a short wiry Italian kid from Brooklyn who was one of the few men small enough to fit into the cramped sphere suspended beneath the bomber's belly. The two waist gunners were Sergeant George Palmer and Sergeant William Hayes, both farm boys from different parts of the Midwest who had known each other about 10 minutes before becoming inseparable friends. The tail gunner was Sergeant Raymond Burke, a former postal worker from Seattle who claimed he had the loneliest job in the airplane but the best view. And there was Henry, the flight engineer, who considered every one of the B-17's thousands of parts to be his personal responsibility. They trained together through the fall of 1942 and winter of 1943, flying practice missions over the Gulf of Mexico and the Florida countryside, learning to work together as a unit. Henry spent hours studying the aircraft's technical manuals until he had memorized every system and subsystem. He learned where every fuel line ran, how every hydraulic actuator operated, which circuit breakers controlled which electrical systems. More importantly, he learned the specific quirks of their particular aircraft, the way the number 2 engine ran slightly rough at certain RPM settings, the hydraulic leak in the landing gear system that maintenance could never quite fix, the tendency of the radio compass to give false readings when the outside temperature dropped below freezing. Every plane was different, like every tractor back home, and knowing their specific machine could make the difference between life and death. In April of 1943 they received orders for England. The 8th Air Force was building up for the strategic bombing campaign against Germany, and they needed crews. They flew their B-17 across the Atlantic via the northern route, stopping in Newfoundland and Iceland before finally arriving at their assigned base near the town of Thorpe Abbotts in eastern England. The base was a collection of Quonset huts and concrete runways carved out of the flat agricultural land, surrounded by hedgerows and small villages that seemed ancient beyond measure to boys from America. The weather was perpetually damp and gray, a far cry from the clear skies of the Midwest, and the constant drizzle seemed to work its way into everything, rusting equipment and rotting leather and generally making life miserable for ground crews who had to keep the aircraft flying. Their first combat mission came in May, a raid against submarine pens in occupied France. Henry had thought he understood fear, had thought that the nervousness before a difficult harvest or the anxiety of the Depression years qualified as real fear, but he discovered that morning that true fear was something entirely different. True fear was climbing into an aluminum tube loaded with high explosives and fuel, knowing that you were about to fly into a sky full of enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire, knowing that men you had breakfast with might be dead by lunch, knowing that your survival depended not just on your own skills but on 100 different factors beyond your control. His hands shook as he performed his pre-flight checks. His stomach churned even though he had not been able to eat breakfast. But once they were airborne and the familiar routine of flight engineering took over, the fear retreated to a manageable level, still present but no longer paralyzing. That first mission was relatively easy, light fighter opposition and moderate flak. All of their bombs hit the target area, and they made it home with only minor damage. But subsequent missions got progressively harder as the Luftwaffe adapted its tactics and the 8th Air Force pushed deeper into German-held territory. Henry saw planes shot down, watched them fall from the sky trailing smoke and fire, sometimes with parachutes blossoming from their fuselages and sometimes not. He saw aircraft return so badly damaged that it seemed impossible they had stayed in the air, with holes you could crawl through in the fuselage and engines shot away and hydraulic fluid coating everything. He learned to perform emergency repairs in flight, patching fuel lines with rubber hose and wire, bypassing damaged electrical systems, redistributing fuel to compensate for leaking tanks. By October of 1943 their crew had completed 15 missions, halfway to the required total of 25 that would earn them a ticket home. They had survived longer than most. The odds were brutal. Simple mathematics said that most bomber crews would not make it through their tour, and every mission felt like spinning a roulette wheel with death as the house. They dealt with it in different ways. Morrison talked constantly, filling the intercom with chatter until Rourke told him to shut up. Luciano wrote long letters to his mother every night. Hayes and Palmer played endless games of gin rummy with a worn deck of cards. Chin read philosophy books and quoted Confucius. Henry wrote brief letters home describing nothing about combat and everything about the English countryside, the hedgerows and the small villages and the way the afternoon light slanted across the fields in ways that reminded him of Iowa. The mission briefing on October 15 started like any other. They woke to darkness, stumbled to the mess hall for powdered eggs and coffee that tasted like motor oil, then gathered in the briefing room where intelligence officers pulled back the curtain covering the wall map to reveal their target for the day. Bremen, a major port city in northern Germany. The target was a factory complex producing components for U-boats, the submarines that were strangling Allied shipping in the Atlantic. The route would take them across the English Channel, over the Netherlands, then into northern Germany before turning for the target. Expected opposition was listed as heavy, both fighters and flak, and the weather forecast called for scattered clouds at their bombing altitude of 20,000 feet. It would be a rough one, they all knew that, but they were all rough ones now. Henry performed his pre-flight inspection with particular care that morning, something in his gut telling him to be extra thorough. He checked every access panel, every fluid level, every control surface. The No. 3 engine had been acting up during their last mission, running hot and losing oil pressure during the return flight. The ground crew swore they had fixed it, had replaced some gaskets and adjusted the fuel mixture, but Henry did not entirely trust the repair. He climbed up into the engine nacelle with a flashlight and examined the work, checking torque on the bolts, looking for any sign of leakage, testing the security of fuel lines and oil lines. Everything looked acceptable, but that nagging feeling persisted. He made a note to monitor that engine closely during the flight. They took off at 0700 hours, their B-17 joining the stream of bombers that rose into the dawn sky like a swarm of metal insects. The formation assembled over England, dozens of aircraft finding their assigned positions in the combat boxes that would provide mutual defensive fire. Henry stood at his position behind the pilots, monitoring the engine instruments, adjusting fuel mixture as they climbed to altitude. The No. 3 engine was running normally, temperature and pressure both in the green, but he kept one eye on those gauges throughout the climb. They crossed the English coast near Lowestoft, the grey water of the North Sea spreading out below them, and settled in for the long flight to the target. The first hour was uneventful, just the steady drone of engines and the cold that seeped through their flight suits despite the heated clothing. They crossed the Dutch coast and anti-aircraft fire began to appear, black puffs of smoke that marked near misses, the explosions close enough sometimes that they could hear the dull thump over the engine noise and feel the aircraft shudder from the concussion. Then the fighters came, Me-109s and FW-190s, diving through the formation and rolling away trailing smoke. The 50 caliber machine guns hammered continuously, the smell of cordite filling the aircraft, spent shell casings rolling around on the floor. Henry divided his attention between his instruments and the window next to him, watching for enemy fighters while monitoring engine performance. They were about 30 minutes from the target when the number 3 engine exploded. One moment it was running normally and the next moment there was a tremendous bang that shook the entire aircraft, followed by a spray of oil that coated the window and blotted out Henry's view of that side. The engine fire warning light illuminated on the panel, bright red and impossible to ignore. Rourke's voice came over the intercom, calm but urgent, "Feather number 3, Henry, we are on fire." Henry hit the feathering button that would rotate the propeller blade's edge onto the wind and reduce drag, then activated the fire suppression system, flooding the engine nacelle with carbon dioxide. The fire warning light stayed on for another 10 seconds that felt like 10 hours, then finally went dark. They were down to 3 engines, but that was manageable. The B-17 could fly and even maintain formation on 3 engines. They had done it before. Henry studied his instruments, looking for secondary damage, checking temperatures and pressures on the remaining engines. Everything looked normal, and he was about to report that to Rourke when he noticed the oil pressure gauge for the number 4 engine starting to drop. Not dramatically, just a slow steady decline that indicated a leak somewhere in the system. He watched it for 30 seconds to confirm the trend, then keyed his intercom. "Lieutenant, we are losing oil pressure on number 4, looks like we took shrapnel damage from the explosion." Rourke responded immediately. "Can you fix it?" Henry was already moving, grabbing his portable oxygen bottle and his toolkit. "Maybe, give me 5 minutes." He made his way aft to the engine access panel, squeezing past Morrison at the radio station and Chin at his bombardier position. The aircraft was bucking in the turbulent air, making movement difficult, and he had to brace himself against the fuselage to avoid being thrown around. He opened the access panel and shone his flashlight into the engine compartment, tracing the oil lines with his eyes, looking for the leak. He found it almost immediately. A piece of shrapnel from the number 3 engine explosion had punctured the oil cooler line on number 4, and oil was streaming out of the hole, carried away by the 200-mile-per-hour wind. At the current rate of loss they would run dry in less than 10 minutes, and an engine without oil would seize up and become deadweight. He pulled out his toolkit and examined the damage more closely, trying to figure out how to patch a high-pressure line in freezing temperatures while wearing bulky gloves and breathing through an oxygen mask. Back on the farm this would have been a simple fix: clamp off the line, replace the damaged section, bleed the system and refill. But here at 20,000 feet over Germany with fighters attacking and flak bursting all around, nothing was simple. He tried the standard repair first, wrapping the line with high-temperature tape from his kit, but the oil pressure was too high and the tape would not seal. The leak continued unabated. He tried tightening the fittings on either side of the damaged section, thinking maybe he could isolate it, but the fittings were already as tight as they would go and the leak was in the line itself, not at a connection point. He looked around the engine compartment, searching for anything that might help, his mind racing through every improvised repair he had ever seen or performed. There had to be a way to stop that leak, had to be some combination of materials and techniques that would work. Then he remembered something from the farm, a trick his father had used to temporarily seal a leaking hydraulic line on the tractor. It had been harvest season, 1934, and they had been in the middle of cutting wheat when the hydraulic line to the header lift had ruptured. They were miles from the barn and the crop needed to come in before a storm system arrived. There was no time to go back for parts. Walter had wrapped the line with leather strips cut from an old belt, then used hose clamps to compress the leather tight around the leak. The leather absorbed some of the fluid and swelled, creating a seal that had held just long enough to finish the field. It was ugly and temporary, but it had worked. Henry looked down at his own belt, standard military issue leather, and made a decision. He unbuckled it and pulled it free, then used his pocket knife to cut a 6-inch section. The leather was stiff from the cold but still pliable enough to work with. He wrapped it around the damaged section of oil line, overlapping the edges, then secured it with wire from his toolkit, twisting the wire tight with pliers. The leak slowed but did not stop completely. He needed more compression, needed something to really clamp down on the leather and force it to seal. He dug through his toolkit looking for anything that might work, but he had no hose clamps, no C-clamps, nothing designed for that kind of pressure application. Morrison's voice crackled over the intercom. fighters coming in at 3 o'clock high. The aircraft shuddered as the waist gunners opened up, and through the access panel Henry could see a German fighter flash past trailing smoke. They did not have time for him to fiddle with this repair much longer. He thought about his options, mentally cataloging everything he had seen in the aircraft that might serve as a makeshift clamp. And then he remembered the emergency oxygen bottles, each one secured in its rack with a metal band that cinched tight with a screw mechanism. He scrambled back to the nearest oxygen bottle station, removed the securing band, and carried it back to the engine compartment. The band fit almost perfectly around the wrapped oil line. He positioned it over the leather patch and began tightening the screw mechanism, watching the leather compress, watching the oil leak slow, and finally stop. The pressure gauge for the number 4 engine steadied and began to climb back toward normal. Henry allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, then secured the access panel and made his way back to his station. He plugged his intercom back in. "Lieutenant, oil pressure is stabilizing on number 4, leak is patched." Rourke's relief was audible in his response. "Good work, Henry." But their problems were not over. They still had one engine completely dead and another one running on a jury-rigged repair that might fail at any moment. Worse, they were now several minutes behind the main formation, alone in the sky where German fighters would single them out as an easy target. Rourke made the decision to abort the bomb run and head for home. Chen dumped their bombs in a secondary target area, then they turned west and began the long flight back to England. The next hour was a nightmare. The formation was ahead of them and pulling away, and stragglers were prime targets for German fighters. The Me-109s came at them in pairs, diving from above and behind, forcing the gunners to burn through ammunition at an alarming rate. They shot down one fighter and damaged another, but took hits in the process. A cannon round punched through the tail section, narrowly missing Burke. Another round shattered the ball turret's glass, but Luciano was unhurt. The aircraft was accumulating damage, the airframe punctured in dozens of places, hydraulic fluid leaking from somewhere, control cables fraying under stress. And then Henry noticed the fuel pressure gauge for the number 1 engine starting to fluctuate. Not badly, just small oscillations that indicated turbulence in the fuel line, probably caused by damage to the fuel pump or a restriction in the line itself. If it got worse, the engine would start cutting out, and if that happened they would be down to 2 engines, which was barely enough to keep them in the air at altitude but would make controlled flight nearly impossible. He informed Rourke of the situation and began troubleshooting, trying to isolate the problem. The fuel system on the B-17 was complex, with multiple tanks and transfer pumps and cross-feed valves, all of which had to work together to deliver fuel to the engines. Henry started switching between tanks, watching the pressure gauge to see if the fluctuations changed. They did not, which meant the problem was downstream of the tanks, probably in the lines or pumps. He consulted the engine manual, looking for procedures to bypass a failing fuel pump, but the manual assumed you had spare parts and proper tools and were not flying through combat at 20,000 feet. He needed to think outside the manual, needed to improvise. He studied the fuel system schematic in his mind, tracing the path that fuel took from the tanks to the engines, looking for a way to reroute flow if the number 1 pump was failing. And then he saw it, a possibility that was not in any manual but that made sense from an engineering standpoint. The number 2 engine was running fine, its fuel pump operating normally. If he could connect the number 2 fuel line to the number 1 engine, he could effectively bypass the failing pump and draw fuel from a good source. But making that connection would require physical access to the fuel lines, which were buried deep in the wing structure, and would require cutting into pressurized lines while in flight, which was about the most dangerous thing a person could attempt. If he made a mistake they would have an instant fuel leak, and fuel leaking in the slipstream could ignite from a spark or a hot surface, and then they would have a fire that would consume the entire aircraft in seconds. He weighed the risks, knowing that if he did nothing the number 1 engine would eventually fail and they might not make it home anyway, and if he tried the repair and it went wrong they would definitely not make it home. It was the kind of decision that made him wish he had listened better in Sunday school back in Iowa, because he could use some divine guidance right about now. He made his choice. "Lieutenant, I need to try something with the fuel lines. It is going to be risky but I think the number 1 pump is going bad and we need to bypass it." There was a pause, and Henry could imagine Rourke up front weighing his options, knowing that he had to trust his crew. "Do what you have to do, Henry, make it work." Henry gathered his tools and some supplies he thought he might need, a length of rubber fuel hose from the emergency kit, some hose clamps he had salvaged from other repairs, his knife, and his father's words echoing in his mind about how every machine talks if you listen. He made his way back to the wing access panel, opened it, and shone his flashlight into the narrow space between the fuel tanks and the outer skin. The fuel lines ran along the wing spar, metal tubes about an inch in diameter, carrying high-pressure fuel to the engines. He identified the lines for engines 1 and 2, traced them with his eyes to make sure he understood the routing correctly. The plan was simple in concept but terrifying in execution. He would cut the fuel line going to the number 1 engine, downstream of the failing pump. Then he would splice in his rubber hose, connecting it to a T-fitting that he would create by puncturing the fuel line going to the number 2 engine. The rubber hose would be held in place with hose clamps and would allow fuel from the number 2 system to feed the number 1 engine. It was completely against regulations, violated about a dozen safety protocols, and would probably get him court-martialed if they survived long enough for him to be court-martialed. He positioned himself as comfortably as possible in the cramped space, braced against the wing structure, and began working. First he wrapped rags around the section of number 1 fuel line that he needed to cut, to catch any fuel that would spill when he made the incision. Then he took his knife and very carefully scored the metal tubing, not cutting through but creating a weak point. He used his pliers to crack the tubing at the score mark, snapping it cleanly, and fuel immediately began pouring out. He worked quickly, jamming one end of the rubber hose onto the broken line and securing it with a hose clamp, tightening it until he was sure it would not blow off under pressure. The fuel flow slowed to a trickle past the hose. Now came the really dangerous part. He positioned himself next to the fuel line for the number 2 engine, said a quick prayer to whatever deity might be listening, and used a nail from his tool kit to punch a small hole in the metal tubing. Fuel sprayed out immediately, coating his hands and his tools, and he forced himself to stay calm as he worked the rubber hose over the hole and secured it with another hose clamp. For a moment the connection leaked badly, fuel streaming out past the hose, and Henry thought he had failed and they were all about to die in a ball of fire. But he tightened the clamp more, compressing the rubber against the metal, and the leak slowed and stopped. He had one more problem to solve. The connection was secure but the fuel pressure in the number 2 line was higher than what the number 1 engine expected, because it was feeding both engines now. He needed a way to regulate the flow, to prevent flooding the number 1 engine with too much fuel. And sitting there in the wing, his hands covered in aviation fuel, his oxygen running low, Henry Dobbins had an idea so crazy that he almost laughed out loud. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the pack of chewing gum that Morrison had given him that morning, unwrapped a piece, chewed it quickly to soften it, then worked the gum into a small ball and pressed it partially into the hole he had made in the number 2 fuel line, creating a restriction that would reduce flow. It was insane. It was desperate. It should not have worked. But when Henry checked the fuel pressure gauge for the number 1 engine it had stabilized at exactly the right level, the gum restriction creating just enough resistance to balance the system. He secured everything as best he could, made sure all the connections were tight, then crawled back out of the wing and returned to his station. His hands were shaking, both from the cold and from the adrenaline crash, and he had to grip the edge of the instrument panel to steady himself. "Lieutenant, fuel system is bypassed, engine 1 should be stable now." Rourke's voice came back. "You are a mad genius, Henry, whatever you did it is working." The number 1 engine was running smoothly, drawing fuel from the improvised cross-feed that should not have existed, regulated by a wad of chewing gum that should not have been able to handle fuel pressure. They were still flying on 3 engines with the 4th one dead, still alone over hostile territory, still taking damage from fighter attacks, but they were flying, and as long as they were flying there was hope. The German fighters finally broke off as they approached the Dutch coast, low on fuel and ammunition themselves, and the battered B-17 limped out over the North Sea. The English coast appeared through the clouds ahead of them, the most beautiful sight Henry had ever seen. They made it to their base with fuel gauges reading nearly empty, the hydraulic system barely functional, and the crew exhausted beyond measure. The landing was rough, Rourke fighting with controls that were damaged and unresponsive, but they got the wheels down and touched down hard on the runway, the aircraft bouncing and skidding before finally rolling to a stop. When Henry climbed out of the aircraft, his legs would not support him and he sat down hard on the concrete. Other crew members were doing the same, sitting or lying on the ground, alive when by all rights they should have been dead. The ground crew swarmed over the aircraft, counting bullet holes, examining damage, shaking their heads in disbelief that the plane had made it home. The crew chief found Henry and demanded to know what in God's name he had done to the fuel system, because the engines were hooked up in ways that made no sense and appeared to violate the laws of physics. Henry explained as best he could, and the crew chief stared at him like he had grown a second head, then finally said, "That should not have worked, you understand that, right? That should have gotten you all killed." But it had worked, and that was all that mattered. Word of Henry's improvised repairs spread quickly through the base. Other mechanics came to examine the aircraft, taking photographs and making sketches, trying to understand how a flight engineer with no formal education beyond high school had managed to cobble together a fuel system that kept a crippled bomber in the air. Officers from Engineering Command arrived a week later, wanting detailed explanations, wanting to know if the technique could be taught or standardized. Henry tried to explain that it was not really a technique, it was just doing what had to be done with whatever was available, the same thing he had been doing on the farm since he was a boy. They wrote it up in a technical report, calling it an innovative field repair that demonstrated the importance of mechanical aptitude and creative thinking under pressure. They recommended Henry for a medal, though he never received one, the paperwork getting lost somewhere in the vast bureaucratic machine of the military. But he did receive something more valuable, a reputation as the man who could fix anything, the flight engineer that other crews wanted on their aircraft, because if something went wrong, Henry Dobbins would figure out a way to keep you alive. He flew 17 more missions with Rourke's crew, each one bringing new challenges and new opportunities to demonstrate the kind of improvised engineering that had become his trademark. There was the mission over Hamburg where the tail hydraulics failed and Henry rigged a manual control system using cables stripped from other parts of the aircraft, allowing Burke to continue operating his gun turret. There was the raid on Schweinfurt where the oxygen system developed a leak and Henry fashioned emergency regulators from parts of the intercom system, keeping everyone conscious until they descended to lower altitude. There was the mission where electrical failure knocked out half their instruments and Henry rewired the entire panel using flashlight batteries and wire he pulled from the landing gear bay. But none of those repairs matched the legend of the Bremen mission, the day he kept them flying with leather and chewing gum in pure determination. Other crews started carrying extra supplies that Henry recommended, lengths of rubber hose and spare clamps and even packs of chewing gum, though most of them did not really believe they would ever need to use gum as a fuel pressure regulator. Some of the younger mechanics sought him out for advice, wanting to learn how to think the way he thought, how to look at a problem and see solutions that were not in any manual. Henry tried to explain that it was not something you could really teach from a book, it was something you learn by doing, by working with your hands and understanding how machines function not just as collections of parts but as living systems that responded to inputs and conditions. The winter of 1943 turned into spring of 1944, and the air war over Europe intensified. The 8th Air Force was growing stronger with each passing month, more aircraft and more crews arriving to replace the losses that continued to mount. The targets got deeper into Germany, the opposition remained fierce, and bomber crews continued to face odds that would give any reasonable person nightmares. But they kept flying because someone had to, because the strategic bombing campaign was slowly but surely degrading Germany's ability to wage war, destroying factories and refineries and transportation networks that the Nazi war machine depended upon. Henry completed his 25th mission in April of 1944, earning his ticket home after a year of combat flying. The crew threw a party that night in one of the Quonset huts, with alcohol acquired through various unofficial channels and a general atmosphere of celebration mixed with the knowledge that tomorrow someone else would be sitting in Henry's position and the war would continue without them. Rourke made a speech, slurring his words slightly from the whiskey, talking about how Henry had saved their lives more times than any of them could count and how the Air Force needed 1,000 more mechanics like him. Chen presented Henry with a hand-drawn certificate naming him an honorary engineer, which was touching even though Chen had clearly been drinking when he made it because the lettering was uneven and there was a coffee stain in one corner. The journey home took 2 weeks, traveling by military transport first to Scotland, then by ship across the Atlantic to New York. Henry stood at the rail as the ship entered New York Harbor, watching the Statue of Liberty emerge from the morning mist, and felt a complicated mixture of emotions that he could not quite articulate. Relief at being alive. Guilt about the men who had not made it back. Pride in what they had accomplished. Uncertainty about what came next. The war in Europe was far from over, and there was still the entire Pacific theater where Marines and soldiers were fighting their way across islands with names he could barely pronounce. But his part was done, at least for now, and he was going home to Iowa. Walter and Margaret Dobbins met him at the train station in Waverly, and his father looked older than Henry remembered, more gray in his hair and deeper lines in his face. They did not talk much on the drive back to the farm, just small comments about the weather and the crops and who had gotten married or died while Henry was away. The farm looked exactly as he had left it 2 years earlier, the same buildings and the same equipment and the same endless horizon stretching away in all directions. It should have felt comforting, this return to familiar surroundings, but instead Henry felt oddly disconnected, as if he were visiting a place from his past rather than returning to his home. He tried to settle back into farm life but found it more difficult than he had expected. The work was still there, tractors still needed fixing and crops still needed attention, but it all seemed smaller somehow, less urgent than it had before. He would be in the middle of repairing the threshing machine and suddenly find himself thinking about the Bremen mission, about the feel of fuel soaking through his gloves and the sound of fighters attacking and the desperate improvisation that had kept them alive. He would wake up at night from dreams that placed him back in the aircraft, back at 20,000 feet with warning lights flashing and engines failing, and it would take him several minutes to remember that he was home, safe in his childhood bedroom with Iowa spreading out peacefully beyond the window. His parents noticed but did not press him to talk about it. Walter understood better than most what it was like to come back from war changed, to find that the person who had left was not quite the same as the person who returned. He gave Henry space and time, let him work through whatever needed working through, and trusted that eventually his son would find his footing again. Margaret worried more openly, trying to get Henry to eat more and sleep better and socialize with the young people in town, but Henry had no interest in dances or church socials or the kind of normal life that everyone seemed to expect him to resume. Summer turned to fall and Henry began to find his rhythm again, slowly reacquainting himself with the patterns of agricultural life. He helped with the harvest, which was good that year, and spent long days on the tractor driving up and down the fields while his mind wandered through memories and possibilities. He realized at some point during those autumn weeks that he could not stay on the farm forever, that his experiences had changed him in ways that made the old life impossible to fully embrace again. He loved his parents and he loved the land, but there was a restlessness in him now, a need to be doing something that felt more connected to the skills he had developed and the things he had learned. In November of 1944 he received a letter from the Army Air Forces offering him a position as a civilian instructor at a training facility in Texas, teaching aircraft mechanics the kind of improvised repair techniques that had saved his crew over Bremen. The pay was decent and it would contribute to the war effort in a meaningful way without requiring him to fly combat missions again. He discussed it with his parents over dinner one evening, explaining the opportunity and what it would mean. Walter looked at him for a long time before speaking, then said, "You have to do what feels right, boy. Your mother and I will manage the farm just fine. We did it before you were born and we will do it when you leave again." Margaret cried a little but nodded her agreement, understanding that her son had been changed by forces beyond her control and that trying to hold him here would only make him unhappy. Henry accepted the position and left for Texas after Christmas, promising to write regularly and visit when he could. The training facility was at Randolph Field near San Antonio, a massive complex dedicated to producing the mechanics and technicians that the expanding Air Force needed. His job was to teach a specialized course in emergency repairs, using actual damaged aircraft components and simulated combat scenarios to give students hands-on experience with the kind of problems they might encounter in the field. He was not a natural teacher at first, struggled with explaining concepts that seemed intuitive to him but were foreign to students fresh out of basic training. But he learned to break things down into simpler steps, to demonstrate rather than lecture, to let the students make mistakes and figure out solutions themselves rather than just telling them the answers. He discovered that he enjoyed teaching more than he had expected. There was satisfaction in watching a student grasp a concept, in seeing someone successfully complete a difficult repair using techniques Henry had shown them. He incorporated stories from his combat experience, not the dramatic parts about fighters and flak but the practical details about what actually broke and how he had fixed it. The leather belt and chewing gum repair became a favorite story, one that students would retell to each other with growing embellishment until Henry hardly recognized his own experience. But the core message remained consistent, that improvisation and creative thinking were just as important as technical knowledge, and that the best mechanics were the ones who could adapt to unexpected situations. The war in Europe ended in May of 1945 with Germany's surrender, and the war in the Pacific ended in August after atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Henry received letters from various members of his old crew, men scattered across the country trying to rebuild civilian lives after years of military service. Rourke was going to law school in Philadelphia. Chin had taken a job with an aircraft manufacturer in California. Morrison was working in radio broadcasting in Boston, which surprised absolutely no one. The letters were cheerful on the surface, but Henry could read between the lines, could sense the same restlessness and disconnection that he had felt himself. They were all trying to find their place in a world that had moved on while they were gone, trying to reconcile who they had been with who they had become. Henry continued teaching through 1946 as the military downsized and transitioned to a peacetime footing. The Air Force became independent from the Army that year, a separate branch of service, and there were discussions about retaining him as a permanent instructor with civil service status. But by that point Henry had been thinking about other possibilities, about ways to apply his skills outside the military context. Aircraft were becoming more common in civilian life, with airlines expanding and private aviation growing, and there was increasing demand for qualified mechanics who understood the complexities of modern aircraft systems. In early 1947 he left the Air Force and took a position with Trans World Airlines, working as a senior mechanic at their maintenance facility in Kansas City. The work was different from military aviation, less urgent and more regulated, with strict procedures and oversight from the Civil Aeronautics Administration. But the fundamental challenges remained the same: keeping aircraft flying safely and efficiently, diagnosing problems, implementing repairs. Henry brought to the job the same philosophy he had learned on the farm and refined in combat, the belief that machines would tell you what was wrong if you paid attention and that creative solutions were often more effective than standard procedures. He earned a reputation at TWA for being able to solve problems that stumped other mechanics, for finding innovative approaches to maintenance challenges. When a series of engine failures on the Lockheed Constellation aircraft threatened to ground the fleet, Henry traced the problem to a subtle flaw in the fuel management system and devised a modification that corrected the issue. When structural cracks began appearing in the wing spars of older aircraft, Henry developed an inspection technique that could detect the cracks before they became dangerous. His work caught the attention of senior management, and within a few years he was promoted to maintenance supervisor, overseeing teams of mechanics and developing training programs for new hires. He met Sarah Brennan in 1948 at a USO dance in Kansas City, one of those social events that he normally avoided but that a coworker had convinced him to attend. Sarah was a nurse at the city hospital, a practical woman with dark hair and green eyes and a no-nonsense attitude that Henry found refreshing after years of military formality and corporate bureaucracy. They talked for most of the evening, discovering shared backgrounds as children of the Depression who had learned to value hard work and self-reliance. She was not particularly interested in aviation or mechanics, but she was interested in Henry, in the quiet competence he projected and the way he seemed comfortable in his own skin despite whatever demons he carried from the war. They married in June of 1949 in a small ceremony attended by family and a few close friends. Henry's parents made the journey from Iowa, Walter still moving with the careful precision of a man whose body had been worn down by decades of farm labor. Rourke came from Philadelphia, and Chin flew in from California, and the three of them spent an entire evening reminiscing about missions and near disasters and the strange brotherhood that formed between men who had shared mortal danger. Sarah listened to their stories with patience and occasional amusement, understanding that this was a part of Henry's past that would always be with him even as he built a future with her. They bought a small house in a Kansas City suburb, a modest 2-bedroom structure with a garage where Henry could work on projects and a backyard where they eventually hoped to have children playing. Henry continued his career with TWA, moving up through the ranks of management while maintaining his connection to the practical work of aircraft maintenance. He never lost the hands-on approach he had learned from his father, never became the kind of manager who was content to sit in an office while other people did the actual work. He could still tear down an engine or trace a wiring problem or fabricate a replacement part, and the mechanics who worked under him respected that. Their first child arrived in 1951, a daughter they named Ellen after Sarah's mother. 2 sons followed, Robert in 1953 and James in 1955, and the Dobbins household became busier and louder and filled with the kinds of chaos that small children naturally generate. Henry discovered that fatherhood required many of the same skills as mechanics: patience and problem-solving and the ability to improvise when things did not go according to plan. He taught his children the same lessons his father had taught him, about the value of hard work and the importance of understanding how things functioned. The garage became a classroom where Ellen and Robert and James learned to use tools and fix bicycles and take apart old appliances to see what made them tick. The years passed in the way they do for people living ordinary lives, marked by the small milestones of family and career. Birthdays and holidays, school events and little league games, promotions at work and home improvements and family vacations to places like the Grand Canyon and Yellowstone. Henry stayed in touch with some of his old crew members through annual Christmas cards and occasional phone calls, watching from a distance as they built their own families and careers. Rourke became a successful attorney and eventually a judge. Chin worked his way up to chief engineer at Douglas Aircraft. Morrison somehow ended up owning a chain of radio stations across New England. They had all survived the war and gone on to have good lives, which was more than could be said for millions of others. The aviation industry continued to evolve throughout the 1950s and 60s, with jet engines replacing propellers and aircraft becoming larger and faster and more complex. Henry adapted to each new generation of technology, taking courses and reading technical manuals and maintaining the same curiosity about mechanical systems that had driven him since childhood. He retired from TWA in 1976 at the age of 55, having spent nearly 30 years with the airline and having contributed to countless improvements in maintenance procedures and safety protocols. Retirement did not mean stopping work entirely. Henry opened a small shop in his garage where he repaired small engines and appliances for neighbors and friends, charging minimal fees because the work itself was the reward. He taught a weekend course at the local community college on basic mechanics, sharing with a new generation the philosophy that machines were not mysterious black boxes but understandable systems that followed logical principles. He volunteered at a local aviation museum, helping to restore old aircraft including AB-17 that reminded him powerfully of his combat days. Working on that bomber brought back memories both painful and proud, and sometimes he would stand in the cockpit or the flight engineer's position and remember what it had felt like to be young and scared and determined to keep his crew alive. In 1983, 40 years after the Bremen mission, Henry received a letter from a military historian who was researching innovative field repairs during World War II. Someone had mentioned Henry's name in connection with the leather and chewing gum fuel system fix, and the historian wanted to interview him and possibly include the story in a book about improvised engineering in combat. Henry was reluctant at first, not seeing why anyone would care about something that had happened so long ago, but Sarah convinced him to do the interview. "It might be important," she said, "for people to understand that wars were not won just by generals and grand strategies but by ordinary people doing extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it." The historian came to Kansas City and spent an entire afternoon asking questions and recording Henry's answers on a cassette tape recorder. Henry told the story as accurately as he could remember, including the parts where he had been terrified and uncertain, where he had no idea if his improvised repairs would work or would kill everyone. The historian was particularly interested in Henry's thought process, how he had diagnosed the problems and conceived of solutions under extreme pressure. Henry tried to explain that it had not been as systematic as the historian seemed to think, that much of it had been instinct and desperation and memories of watching his father work on broken tractors decades earlier. But the historian insisted there was something more there, some quality of mind that allowed certain people to see possibilities that others missed. The book was published in 1985 and included a chapter about Henry's repairs over Bremen, along with similar stories of innovative problem-solving from other theaters of the war. Henry's children bought copies and read with amazement about things their father had never discussed in detail, adventures and dangers that seemed to belong to a completely different person than the quiet man who had raised them. The book had modest success, selling mostly to military history enthusiasts and veterans, but it brought Henry a small measure of recognition. He received letters from other veterans who remembered similar desperate improvisations, from mechanics who wanted to share their own stories, from young people who were inspired by the idea that creative thinking could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. One letter came from Vincent Luciano, the ball turret gunner from Henry's old crew, whom Henry had not heard from in nearly 20 years. Luciano was living in Florida, retired from a career in construction, and had read the book and immediately recognized the Bremen mission even before he saw Henry's name. He wrote about how he still remembered that flight, how he had been sure they were going to die when the engine started failing, how he had felt the aircraft shudder and lurch and had known something was badly wrong. He remembered hearing Henry's voice on the intercom, calm and focused, saying he was working on the problem, and how that had given him hope that maybe they would make it. The letter ended with an invitation for Henry to visit if he ever found himself in Florida, and a simple statement of gratitude: "You saved my life that day and I never properly thanked you for it, so thank you, Henry, thank you for keeping us flying." Henry wrote back and they began corresponding regularly, reconnecting after all the years and finding that they still had the easy camaraderie that forms between people who have shared extreme experiences. Through Luciano, Henry reconnected with Burke and Hayes, both of whom were still alive and doing well. Hayes was a grandfather multiple times over and still living in Nebraska. Burke had moved to Oregon and worked for the Postal Service until retirement, coming full circle to the job he had held before the war. They talked about organizing a reunion, but between health issues and the logistics of getting elderly men to travel across the country, it never quite came together. But they stayed in touch through letters and phone calls, maintaining a connection that had been forged in fire 40 years earlier. Walter Dobbins passed away in 1987 at the age of 89, dying peacefully in his sleep on the Iowa farm where he had spent his entire life. Henry traveled back for the funeral and helped sort through his father's possessions, finding the barn still filled with old equipment and boxes of spare parts and tools that Walter had accumulated over 7 decades. Many of the pieces were the same ones Henry had learned on as a boy: wrenches worn smooth by years of use, toolboxes organized with Walter's methodical precision. Henry kept a few items as mementos, including his father's favorite pipe wrench and a small tackle box full of spare bolts and screws and other hardware that Walter had never been able to throw away because you never knew when you might need them. Going through the barn, Henry found a wooden box he did not remember seeing before, tucked away on a high shelf and covered with dust. Inside were newspaper clippings, yellowed with age, articles from the local paper about Henry's military service and his return home after the war. There was the letter from the Army Air Forces offering him the teaching position. There were photographs of Henry in uniform, young and serious, looking like someone's idea of what a hero should look like, even though Henry had never felt particularly heroic. And there was a handwritten note in Walter's careful script that said simply, "Proud of you, son, you did good." Henry sat in the barn for a long time with that note in his hands, crying quietly for the father who had shaped him and who had understood him perhaps better than anyone else ever would. Sarah Dobbins died in 1992 after a brief battle with cancer, and Henry found himself alone in a way he had not been since before the war. Their children were grown with families of their own, Robert in Seattle and James in Denver and Ellen just across town in Kansas City. They visited regularly and called often and made sure Henry was not isolated, but the house felt empty in a way that no amount of company could quite fill. He kept busy with his projects and his volunteer work, but the nights were long and quiet, and sometimes he would sit in the dark and think about all the people he had lost over the years, crew members who had died in combat, friends from after the war who had succumbed to age or illness, his parents, his wife. But he also thought about the people he had saved, about Rourke and Chen and Morrison and Luciano and Burke and Hayes and Palmer, 8 men who had lived full lives because Henry had remembered how his father fixed a tractor with a belt and some wire. He thought about the thousands of flights he had maintained at TWA, the millions of passengers who had arrived safely at their destinations because Henry and mechanics like him had done their jobs well. He thought about the students he had taught, both at Randolph Field and at the community college, young people who had learned from him not just how to fix engines but how to approach problems with creativity and confidence. When he added it all up that way, it seemed like a life that had mattered, a life that had made a difference however small in the grand scheme of things. In 2003, 60 years after the Bremen mission, the Aviation Museum where Henry volunteered organized a special exhibit about improvised repairs in military aviation. The centerpiece was a B-17 that had been restored to flying condition, and the museum wanted to honor Henry as a representative of all the mechanics and engineers who had kept aircraft flying during the war. They arranged a ceremony where Henry would give a short talk about his experiences, and they planned to fly the B-17 as a demonstration for the crowd that was expected to attend. Henry was 82 years old by then, his hands stiff with arthritis and his hearing not what it used to be, but his mind remained sharp and his memories of that October day over Bremen were still vivid. He prepared his remarks carefully, writing them out longhand because he had never been comfortable speaking off the cuff. He wanted to make sure he conveyed the right message, that the repairs he had made were not the result of genius or special talent but simply the application of lessons learned from a lifetime of working with machines, that improvisation was a skill anyone could develop if they paid attention and remained calm under pressure, that the real heroes were the pilots who flew into danger and the gunners who fought off attackers and all the people who did their jobs despite the fear. The day of the ceremony was clear and warm, perfect weather for flying, and several hundred people gathered at the museum to watch the B-17 take off. Henry stood on the platform set up near the runway and delivered his speech, his voice strong despite his age, talking about the mission and the repairs and what it had felt like to work on fuel lines while fighters attacked and engines failed. He talked about his father and the farm and how the skills he learned in Iowa had saved lives over Germany. He talked about the importance of education and training but also the importance of creativity and the willingness to try unconventional solutions when conventional ones were not available. Then the B-17 started its engines, the sound of those big radial engines unmistakable and powerful, a sound that Henry had not heard in person for decades but that he recognized instantly. The bomber taxied to the runway and took off, climbing into the blue sky, banking over the museum grounds so that everyone could see it in flight. Henry watched with tears streaming down his face, remembering what it had been like to fly in one of those machines, remembering the weight of responsibility and the camaraderie of the crew and the terror and exhilaration of combat. The aircraft made several passes, the crowd cheering and taking photographs, and then it landed smoothly and taxied back to the museum. The ceremony concluded with the presentation of a plaque honoring Henry's service, and there were handshakes and photographs and people thanking him for his contributions. But the most meaningful moment came when a young woman approached him, maybe 30 years old, wearing the uniform of an Air Force mechanic. She introduced herself as Captain Jennifer Martinez and said she had read about Henry's story in a training manual at the Air Force Technical School where she had learned her trade. She said his example of innovative problem-solving under pressure had inspired her to push herself harder and to never accept that something could not be fixed. She said she had specifically requested leave to attend this ceremony because she wanted to meet the man whose improvised fuel system repair had become legendary in Air Force maintenance circles. Henry did not know what to say at first, struck by the idea that something he had done 6 decades earlier was still being taught to new generations of mechanics. He finally managed to tell Captain Martinez that he hoped she never had to make repairs under the kind of conditions he had faced, but that if she did he was confident she would figure it out because clearly she had the right mindset. They talked for a while about aircraft systems and maintenance philosophy, and Henry was impressed by her knowledge and her obvious passion for her work. It made him feel good to know that the Air Force was in capable hands, that young people like Captain Martinez were carrying forward the traditions and the skills that had been developed by his generation. Henry Dobbins lived for 7 more years after that ceremony, dying peacefully in 2010 at the age of 89, the same age his father had been at death. He was buried in a small cemetery in Kansas City with military honors, a flag draped over his casket and an honor guard firing a salute. His 3 children and 8 grandchildren and 4 great-grandchildren attended, along with several dozen people whose lives Henry had touched in various ways over the decades. Vincent Luciano, then 90 years old and confined to a wheelchair, made the journey from Florida to pay his respects to the man who had saved his life. The obituary in the Kansas City Star was brief, noting that Henry had served as a flight engineer during World War II and had later worked for Trans World Airlines for 30 years. It did not mention the Bremen mission or the leather belt and chewing gum repair, because Henry had never sought publicity for his wartime service. But the Aviation Museum where he had volunteered included a permanent exhibit about his life and his innovative repairs, with photographs and artifacts and a detailed explanation of what he had done to keep that crippled bomber flying. The exhibit concluded with a quote from Henry taken from his 2003 speech, the words representing his philosophy about work and life and problem solving. The quote read, "My father taught me that every machine will tell you what is wrong with it if you listen carefully and stay calm. He taught me that solutions are everywhere if you are willing to look beyond the obvious, and he taught me that sometimes you have to trust your instincts and try something that has never been done before because doing nothing is not an option when lives depend on you." Those lessons served me well over Germany in 1943, and they served me well throughout my life, and I hope they might serve others too. The story of Staff Sergeant Henry Dobbins and his improvised repairs over Bremen eventually found its way into official Air Force training materials, used as an example of the kind of innovative thinking that is necessary in critical situations. Military engineers studied his techniques and incorporated principles of field expedient repair into maintenance doctrines. The specific combination of leather and chewing gum became a kind of legend within aviation maintenance communities, a symbol of the ingenuity and determination that characterizes the best mechanics. And somewhere in a museum in Kansas City there is a B-17 Flying Fortress that flies every year on the anniversary of that October day, a living memorial to 8 men who lived because one Iowa farmer's son remembered how to fix a tractor with scrap materials and applied those lessons at 15,000 feet over Nazi Germany.